Betsy asked me to do a second hour, and I thought, oh, a group of us have been working in the archives for the last couple of years. Why not look into more carefully what I would call an origin story for Union Congregational Church. Catherine Spinell and Frith Fobin and Della Smith and I, Christine was part of the early effort. We will welcome you back if you're willing to do that. Have been going through the archives on a weekly basis for an hour, so it's slow going. But I've always felt that origin stories have a special power, because, particularly for organizations, because they get at the original purpose and mission of a group, and they raise questions, they challenge those of us who are involved in that organization, how those principles, those purposes should inform what we're doing now. So that's one of the things I wanted to look at. I really do believe that strong institutions, like strong families, communicate principles across generations. And I think the question for us is, what principles have consistently informed the work and worship of this church? And I like this Wendell Berry quote, that our past is not merely something to depart from, it's to commune with, to speak with. It seems like telling an origin story would be a simple thing, but any of you who've done much historical research find that it makes a real difference where you start and what perspective you adopt. And that's certainly true for Union. Our church histories normally say that we started as a Sabbath school or Sunday school and then created a church, and that's true enough. But it would be similarly true to say that we emerged out of controversy. But given the theme of our church this fall, I wanted to anchor our origin story in neighbors and suggest that Union got its start in community. There are a number of sources for this. I always like to look at maps. The Library of Congress, the Newark Public Library, have digitized some early maps for this area. The Montclair Times is digitized, and if you're willing to go through their paywall, you get access to a real candy store of information. In the 1940s, the Montclair Public Library commissioned what turned out to be a 4-volume scrapbook called The Elegant 80s, the 1880s, and that's digitized and a marvelous resource. And of course, in our archives, we have the minutes of the Standing Committee of the church from 1882 on, so that's from the very beginning. We also have the minutes of the trustees of the society. I'll explain the difference between society and church when we get to that. From 1891 on, we don't, at least I haven't found yet, from 1880 to 1890. There's a wonderful talk in 1919 to the Women's Guild, and another reminiscence at the 50th anniversary, plus the church histories, of course. The railroad came through in 1873 and it changed everything. It was a single-track, one-track railroad. It went along here. You can see in those days the main north-south roads were Valley Road. This is Valley Road. And Grove Street. A couple dozen families lived in the area. Park Street had been laid out, but not too many houses along there. In the mid-1870s, Watchung and Bellevue and part of Alexander were the main east-west streets. What was called Mountain Avenue, now Upper Mountain, had been pushed through. Cliffside Avenue, now Mountain Avenue, had a couple blocks. Mount Hebron Cemetery had been laid out. And I would also point out, right in here is the schoolhouse, which plays an important role in our history. But for more than 150 years, this part of Montclair had been, as described, a land of broad pastures, orchards, meadows, uplands, and woods. And it was populated by a scattering of Dutch families, and you can't read their names, they're kind of listed there. But the Van Giesens, the Spears, the Garabrandts, a number of these Dutch families that had moved into this area around 1700. And it was said of them that they never bought and never sold, never improved, and never died. So they were really stuck in here. Our charter member, Isabella Dorman, recalled that Bellevue Avenue at this time was just a grassy lane. And Mountain Avenue, by which she meant Upper Mountain, was a wild country road with grass on both sides. There were perhaps, as I said, a couple dozen homes. A Sabbath school and prayer meeting had been started in the schoolhouse there in the late 1820s. There was no church in what became Upper Montclair until this one was started. If you wanted to go to church, the closest one was the Brookdale Reformed Church on the other side of Brookdale Park, then called Stonehouse Plains Church. Or you could make your way into Montclair to the Presbyterian Church, then on Church Street, of course, or to the recently formed Congregational Church, among others. First Congregational was started in 1870. The area north of Watchung was called Speartown after the Spear family. Just as Montclair had been called Cranetown after the Crane family. In the 1870s, when a handful of families moved here from Brooklyn, or up from Montclair, it took on the name Cliffside. That name didn't stick. This is the depot, the Bellevue Avenue depot in the early 1880s. This is too fuzzy. That says Upper Montclair on the train depot, and that's the name that stuck for this area. And Mrs. Geneva Raymond, a charter member of our church, supervised the post office in this depot. And from 1877, she also operated a telegraph office there, officiating, as it was said, at the key. The first person to, or perhaps the first person to move from Brooklyn to this area was a young doctor by the name of Morgan Ayres. Decades later, I just find this remarkable, at the 50th anniversary of this church, he recalled the early days of this area and the early days of this church. And he said that more and more dissatisfied people seeking air and comfort from the noises of Brooklyn began to come over the river in shoals. And he added that if it had not been for Brooklyn, this town might not have been put on the map. The most important arrivals, at least for our story, from Brooklyn were Thomas and Sarah Bird. And they came in the 1870s. In 1881, they built the first house on Upper Mountain. Now that's their house there, and you can see there wasn't much else in between. That house is still there. If you go on Upper Mountain and you're going to turn left on Bradford, a couple houses at the end, it's the brown stucco house that is in increasing disrepair. I wonder how much longer it's going to last. But that was the home that, the house that Thomas and Sarah Bird built, and it must have been quite grand. Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Moore of paint company fame, owned that house after the Birds. It was said of Thomas Bird, and I just love these mutton chop whiskers, that he was Puritan stock with all the objectionable features eliminated. He was a successful broker on the New York Stock Exchange, but at the same time a devout Christian with a deep commitment to what was later called the social gospel. He was very active at Henry Ward Beecher's Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, and also especially in that church's Bethel mission that worked with working class immigrants on the Brooklyn docks. And that's where he met his wife Sarah, and unfortunately I have not yet found a photograph of Sarah. But she, if anything, was even more energetic in applying Christian ethics to social issues. What she considered, and I love this phrase, the gospel way of doing things without preaching. And it was reported that Henry Ward Beecher commented that, or thought that Mrs. Bird has done more good than any woman who has ever lived in Brooklyn. After her husband died in 1891, we could do a whole second hour on Sarah Bird. She even started a settlement house. This was, Jane Addams, all those settlement houses over the period. She started a settlement house on the Lower East Side of Manhattan among the recently arrived immigrants. She used her own funds. She believed strongly that you live and work among the people that you serve. And she spent most of her time on the Lower East Side for the rest of her life. That was her level of commitment to applying, as I said, Christian ethics to social issues. And she viewed that settlement house, and this is another phrase that I like, she considered what she was doing not a charity, but a hospitality. By 1880, when our church started, the old Dutch farms were being carved up into still rather substantial land holdings. There were no building lots or home lots that had been carved out in this area. If you extend this map down to Watchung and Park, a number of home lots have been identified there. But this map from 1881 helps to anchor us for the rest of our story. So again, this is where the Birds have, I showed you their house. Their property was rather larger in those days. I would also point out Franklin Dorman. I think he worked for a big mercantile firm. I assume he was a cotton broker. But Franklin and Isabella Dorman were very active in the early days of this church. I think they bought that property next door later. Hiram Little lived here on Valley Road. And we're going to talk about Cliffside Chapel. He gave this land for Cliffside Chapel. The wonderfully named R.Z. Eben Van Giesen, one of the old Dutch families, owned this land. This is Valley and Bellevue. We'll talk about Harrison's Grove. There was a walnut grove up here. Charles Anderson bought that property later. Remember, he gave this as Anderson Park. But Harrison's Grove features large in our story. And so does this property over here, too small for somebody's name. That was Jared Van Giesen's property, and after he died, it was acquired, and that's where our first church was. Robert Boyd over here was Sarah Bird's brother, so I'm wondering if the Birds lived here before they built that house. I don't know. And the schoolhouse, again. This is the schoolhouse, right there. Whenever the need rose, the community gathered at the schoolhouse at Valley and Bellevue, and the fan light, see this half circle light? That survived, it was restored. That's in our archives downstairs. Maybe sometime we could find a way to mount it and honor it. I forget when this schoolhouse was built, maybe in the 1840s or the 1850s. Morgan Ayers, Dr. Ayers, recalled that it was in this building that the community gathered for interesting and entertaining school meetings, political caucuses, as well as religious services with visiting clergymen on Sundays and Wednesday evenings. And he recalled also that it was here in this little schoolhouse that, as he put it, the agitation began for raising a fund looking toward the founding of a dream chapel, modestly so named, not aspiring to a church. To raise money for this chapel, neighbors in Upper Montclair undertook all sorts of entertainments. And by neighbors, I mean a few dozen people. This was not highly populated. What the Montclair Times called making strenuous efforts for the erection of a suitable place of worship. The most important entertainments or fundraising efforts that they undertook were harvest home festivals. Everyone pitched in. And Harrison's Grove, again at Bellevue and Upper Mountain, was transformed for an evening. The first one took place in 1877 and raised about $200. The next year featured the first demonstration. You can maybe see it, Professor Edison's telephone, The first public demonstration in Montclair was at this festival, and it was all in the aid of the chapel fund. And in the following year, 1879, the chapel was under construction, so when they raised $800, that was for furnishing Cliffside Chapel. In subsequent years, the total raised reached about $1,000, which is a pretty hefty amount in those days. 40 years later, Isabella Dorman, I showed you where the Dormans lived, president of the Women's Guild in the church, but she recalled these festivals in remarks to the Women's Guild in the 1920s. And I'm going to quote at length from her description, because I just think it's wonderful about what these community gatherings were like. And she wrote or said, it was from Mrs. Bird's, Sarah Bird's, fertile brain that the idea of a Harvest Home Festival originated. Mrs. Bird was a very energetic woman. She saw visions and dreamed dreams. And she had us all at work, and no stone was left unturned whereby we might gain something in numbers, energy, strength, or money toward the new church. Her scheme was to furnish an out-of-door entertainment for an afternoon and evening, to attract money by various shows. And at this time, in summer, our boarding houses for miles around were filled with people from the city. Montclair was a summer destination. It was cooler, it wasn't polluted. There were boarding houses. So these people who were here for the summer welcomed anything to amuse and fill up idle time. Isabella Dorman goes on. So when Mrs. Bird would go into those houses, and she did go for miles around the country, and introduce herself and tell of this wonderful out-of-door day which they could enjoy, and particularly if they would do something toward carrying out the plan, they would accept, and she would leave boxes of dolls to be dressed by them and fancy work of different parts, and of course everyone would be on hand that day. And Dorman goes on, as we were always careful to select the day in the full of the harvest moon, we always had pleasant weather. A great many tents were hired for various purposes. A very large refreshment tent was put up, where suppers were served from 4 to 10 p.m. of clam chowder, fried chicken with Saratoga potatoes, boiled corn, and other dainties. Pies, cakes, and ice cream were served at all times. There was a farmyard for exhibition of particularly fine animals, a moderate-sized hayfield with hay and straw scattered about, and Maud Mullers in costume with their long-handled rakes as background to the rustic lemonade stand. Everybody had something to sell. The dolls had a tent for their exhibition, with a prize offered for the best doll. There were donkey carts and rides for the children. The tent for dramatics was put up at one end in a secluded spot where the bushes helped to screen the place, and plays were given through the afternoon and evening by our dramatic society. Many came early and stayed until the end. Our supplies never ran short. Our mince and pumpkin pies were the good old-fashioned kind, and Mrs. Doremus's pies then became famous. Of course, it took many to carry on the work, and we had the many. Our friends in Montclair, notice the difference between Montclair and Upper Montclair, our friends in Montclair all helped us, even to making pies and cakes which had to be furnished from the homes, as we could not buy as we can now. We hired only a few helpers. We had to have a cook and dishwashers, but all the waiting was done by volunteer helpers. Large calcium lights were used throughout the grove in the evening. We were a merry, hard-working lot, and felt repaid when the proceeds counted up $1,000 or more every time toward our church. After one of these Harvest Home festivals, the Montclair Times commented, "The Harvest Home is over at last, and our ordinarily quiet people have resumed their usual routine and again enjoy peace and quiet, peace and rest to which they have long been strangers. Nothing short of a riot in the Fourth Ward or a Greenback convention," I had to look up Greenback, that was a political party over there, "can so disarrange the ordinary life in Upper Montclair as when it bestirs itself for a chapel." Sounds like today, doesn't it? The real estate boom started. real estate agents picked up on the plans for the church. You can't read this, but in this text over here is one of the benefits to moving here is that a commodious chapel is to be built of trap rock with sandstone trimmings in the Gothic style, furnishing some 300 to 400 sittings, and it's now being built. And this is the church, the chapel, which you will recognize. Everything moved quickly. With the harvest home receipts, other donations, a large grant or donation from the Presbyterian Memorial Fund, contributions from the Sabbath School, the Ladies Sewing Society, and even $5 in proceeds from the Children's Fair, plus contributions of stone, land, trees, and labor, this handsome new cliffside chapel was ready for use in early 1880. And that's when everything fell apart. Up to this point, all had been goodwill and handshakes. The community had been so focused on building the chapel that they had not sorted out how the chapel would be used. And you recall when I started, I said the origin story could be that we emerged out of controversy. This is the controversy. I much prefer the story of that we emerged out of neighbors working in community. But a huge controversy erupted. It was intense, public, highly personal, but mercifully short-lived. The key question was whether the cliffside chapel would be Presbyterian or non-sectarian. The Presbyterians had a good legal case. The land for the chapel had been given by Hiram Little in trust to the Presbyterian Church of Montclair. The largest donation had come from the Presbyterian Memorial Fund. Presbyterian trustees in the Montclair Church had managed the fund accounts. They had hired the builders. On the other hand, the Christian Union folks, led by Thomas Bird and Franklin Dorman, had a good moral case. The community had raised funds explicitly for a non-sectarian chapel, and then had voted 51-2 at a public meeting about what to do about the chapel for a Christian Union use of the chapel rather than Presbyterian. Their main point was those who worship in the chapel should enjoy the privilege of managing its affairs. Well, the Presbyterians went ahead and dedicated the chapel in February 1880, but the service was largely boycotted by the community and by ministers of other denominations. In effect, the Presbyterians ended up with a church building but no congregation, and the Christian Union folks had a congregation but no church building. And after remaining vacant, largely vacant for 7 years, the Episcopal Diocese started a mission up here, and this is St. James Episcopal Church at the corner of Valley and Bellevue. Just switch out that tower with the World War I Memorial Tower, and you have St. James Episcopal Church. That's where their services are held. So for the Christian Union folks, it was back to the schoolhouse. And they treated the loss of Cliffside Chapel, despite all the efforts from the harvest homes and everything, as a setback, not a defeat. They started over again, but this time they took rather greater care to dot their legal I's and cross their legal T's, and thus incorporated the Christian Union Society under New Jersey law. Just a week after the dedication of the Cliffside Chapel by the Presbyterians, the Christian Union folks organized a Sabbath school at the schoolhouse. 74 students signed up. Franklin Dorman agreed to become the superintendent, and he continued in that role for the next 20 years. Once the negotiations over the Cliffside Chapel were abandoned at the beginning of May 1880, the newly formed Christian Union Society organized Sunday afternoon services and invited a number of clergy to take part. They resumed their fundraising efforts with a strawberry festival in June, funds to go to pay for the hymnals, and held another Harvest Home Festival in August, after which the people of Montclair, they would have a community meeting and say, we raised $1,000, how should we use it? And the community voted to apply the proceeds to a newly established, quote, Christian Union Building Fund. By November, the society had called George Gates of Boston to be their pastor, even though he had not yet been ordained. More on that in a bit. Two people keep showing up in the early records, so I call them advisors to unions. Certainly they were informal advisors. The Christian Union Society benefited enormously from their interest, first of the Reverend Amory Howe Bradford, who was the founding minister of First Congregational Church in Montclair, has spent his entire 40-year career in Montclair, but gained an international reputation. And his influence, you know this, his influence in Montclair was extraordinary. For decades, virtually no city improvement project, no progressive cause in Montclair gained traction without his leadership or support. The second one was the Reverend Lyman Abbott, one of the foremost Congregationalists of the day, a leading advocate for integrating Darwin's theories into, in other scientific advances into theological understanding. He succeeded Henry Ward Beecher as the minister of Plymouth Church in Brooklyn in 1888. And if I may, this is where I have a personal connection. Amory Howe Bradford's son, Arthur, became the minister of Central Church in Providence. And in 1938, he went, and he was also a trustee of Yale University. In 1938, he went looking at Yale for an assistant minister. He chose my father. And my father became the assistant to his son. And my father turned down the opportunity to be an assistant minister at Plymouth Church to take the job in Providence. So that's kind of fun too, rather than this. I've wondered, and Cynthia was just raising this, why the community in Upper Montclair chose the name Christian Union for their society and then for the church. We remained the Christian Union Congregational Church until the 1920s. My informed guess, it's a guess, but I can make a case, is that Thomas and Sarah Bird and the others were influenced by the ideals of the Christian Union newspaper in New York, edited by Henry Ward Beecher and Lyman Abbott. Those men had little patience for denominational politics or doctrinal arguments, and they focused on applying Christian ethics to the social problems of their day. An article in the April 3rd, 1881 issue of the paper, this is the banner of the issue of the paper that talks about the first church service here in Upper Montclair. But this is an excerpt from an article in August 1881, and I think it captures well what the people of Upper Montclair were trying to achieve in forming this church nearly 140 years ago. The article happens to be about our friends at First Congregational Church in Montclair, but I think it could just as well be about our church even today. And what it says is, as proof of how the ecclesiastical fences are disregarded by the laity, the article notes how the Montclair Church, First Congregational, has received in the past 10 years Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Christians, and Roman Catholics. All are apparently harmonious and happy. And I love this next sentence. The laity do not care much for the husks as long as they get the corn. In Upper Montclair, the advocates, and I've never called it Upper Montclair. I've always been saying, I live in Montclair. But this has me talking Upper Montclair because of the distinction from those days. The advocates for the Christian Union Society were mostly old-timers, raised in the Dutch Reformed Church tradition. People like A. Eben van Giesen, who was a charter member, or newcomers like Thomas and Sarah Bird, or Franklin and Isabella Dorman, who were Congregationalists. And together they made another attempt in the spring of 1881 to get use of Cliffside Chapel. They were turned down again, so they officially incorporated as a religious society, And by September, they had acquired Jared Van Giesen's property, he had died, and hired an architectural firm, Steiger and Stahlen of Newark, to design a new church building for them on Valley Road. This is the property on Valley, just south of the CVS parking lot, where there are 3 or 4 stores extending back to Northview. That's the original location of this church. This was a surprise to me because it's none of the church histories that I've seen. I think Sarah Bird bought the property quietly and then gave it to the church so that they would have a place to build it. This is clear from a legal notice in the Montclair Times in 1918. The Commonwealth Club took over the church building and the property. They fell behind on their mortgage payments in 1918. The mortgage holder was trying to foreclose, and they have to kind of go through the title. And so this property, formerly of Sarah J. Bird, and then before that of Jared Van Giesen. And then it was given to the Christian Union Congregational Society by Sarah Bird and her husband in two deeds, one in 1882 and the other one in 1888. Those deeds, that transfer also appears in minutes of the trustees of this church from 1905. Otherwise, I find no mention of this gift. You'll find that gifts of property from women are an important part of our church history. This is the church on Valley Road. It's an old postcard. It's a little damaged in a couple places. But I like it because it helps to tell the story. This is the home of the Cooper sisters, of Mary and Harriet Cooper, and they loom large in the story going forward. But things seem to move faster in those days, at least when it comes to constructing public buildings. On April 9th, 1882, just 6 months after that article saying they're going to tear down Jared Van Giesen's home and build this church, the first service took place on April 9th, 1882. And George Gates was still here. But up to this point, Union had operated as this religious society with the regular services led by George Gates. He'd come here when he was 31 years old. He was a graduate of Dartmouth, had studied in Göttingen. He'd gone to Andover. The Congregational Church in Littleton, New Hampshire, called him to be their pastor in 1880. The president of Dartmouth led the ecclesiastical council, and they turned him down. They said they would not ordain him because of his views, his modern views, on future retribution, which I think refers to hell, and for his views on the authority of Scripture. The Christian Union newspaper picked up this story, and their reaction is, if this report is true, the churches may find the reasons why the best, the most thoughtful, and the most earnest young men in our colleges today rarely go into the Christian ministry. And frankly, I wonder if it was this article, who knows, if it was this article about this non-ordination that reached the Birds and the Normans. They got in touch with George Gates immediately, and 3 weeks later, after this article, he gave his first sermon here in Montclair. 2 weeks after that, he was called as their pastor. So that demonstrates something about their openness to what was then liberal theology. So for the first 18 months, he preached without being ordained. But as we saw again yesterday with Katrina, to be ordained, it's an action by a group of churches, and he recommended that the Christian Union Society form a church and be associated with a denomination. And on his recommendation, they agreed to form Christian Union Congregational Church, 1882. The articles of the new church, these are the books that are in the archives. They spell out its character in relation to other churches. An independent ecclesiastical body, I think that's in here. This is too fuzzy for you to read. But an independent ecclesiastical body, and in matters of doctrine and discipline, not amenable to other organizations, but at the same time keen to cooperate with other Christian churches. It also spelled out the basis of union with the Christian Union Society, which continued to hold the property and was responsible for the finances of the church, essentially the trustee function of the church. The new Christian Union Congregational Church was responsible for all things related to worship and membership. There was a standing committee formed. They acted as concurrent bodies in settling a pastor. The church would call or dismiss the pastor, the minister, and then the society would had to confirm him. And they adopted the Apostles' Creed as their statement of faith. So 4 days after the first service in the church, a council of congregational churches with more than 20 delegates gathered in the new Valley Road Church, just like yesterday at Old First Reformed in Philadelphia. They were called to order, surprise, by Amory Bradford. The council voted to accept Christian Union Congregational Church as a church in good standing, and to ordain George Gates following an examination of his theological views led by, surprise, Lyman Abbott. The church started with 35 members. The Christian Union Society had some 80 to 90 members. I don't understand why they didn't all join the church. On the 25th anniversary of the society, of the church, the annual report listed the original members. These names are also listed in hand in the minutes of the standing committee of the church in the archives. They were mostly transfers from other congregational churches, but there were 4 from the what's now the Brookdale Reformed Church, as well as some Methodists and Presbyterians. The largest contingent came from First Congregational in Montclair, including 3 who had been deacons. Amory Bradford was fairly magnanimous to lose 3 of his best members to this church. Winslow Ames, Franklin Dorman, and D. Brainerd Hunt. Good little names. 9 members joined on profession of faith. Harvest Home fundraisers continued for several more years, although they apparently shifted to the grounds around the church on Valley Road. Our archives include a bill of fare from 1884 for the restaurant that was set up on that occasion, and a program from 1886 with this nice engraving of the Valley Road Church on the cover. The 1886 program lists, and I'm not sure you can read this, but there were various booths with craft items related to different nationalities. What do we have here? French, German, Italian, Swiss, Japanese, Spanish, Swedish, a restaurant, an ice cream tent, a dairy, lemonade and soda water, confectionery, a dramatic tent. The children put on a farce called The Lost Pet twice in the afternoon, and this describes it as intended for young folks, old folks, or any folk. And it was followed by a laughable farce for the adults in which 3 men acted, and one wonders if there was a bit of lighthearted cross-dressing, since the farce was called Penelope Ann, or The Strange Adventures of a Morning. By the 10th anniversary of the church in 1892, it had grown to 102 members, average attendance of 100 in the Sunday school. They threw an anniversary dinner. Some 200 people came to the dinner, and in a rather touching way, they left an empty chair, a vacant chair, for Thomas Bird, who had died a few months before. The Montclair Times reported, "Perhaps the most beautiful feature of the evening was the vacant chair twisted with a living vine in memory of Thomas H. Bird, than whom the church never had a more loyal supporter or a more faithful friend." He was chairman of the trustees from the beginning through 1891. George Gates left Union in 1887. to become the second president of Grinnell College in Iowa. That's the Iowa connection. After several years there, he moved to California and became president of Pomona College. And then I think he demonstrated his personal commitment to racial justice in an era of Jim Crow, because he ended his career as the third president of Fisk University, the historically black university in Nashville, Tennessee. By the way, the president of Dartmouth changed his tune. In 1892, he arranged for George Gates to get an honorary doctorate, and even suggested that he might be a good man to succeed him as president of Dartmouth. So things were shifting during this period. At Union, Gates was succeeded by Lester Platt, who lasted a year or two, F.B. Vrooman, who lasted a matter of months. William Whedon was then called as the next minister, and the church started to grow again, reflecting largely the growth in Upper Montclair. Whedon had to withdraw due to poor health, although I think he later became the minister of the Summit Congregational Church. But first he did a really good thing. He helped to recruit and persuade Howard Bliss to come to Montclair. Bliss was 31 years old. He's pictured here with his family. Came in June 1894. He had already forged a sterling reputation. He was a graduate of Amherst and Union Theological Seminary, and he had been the assistant minister to Lyman Abbott at Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. Church membership grew really rapidly during his 8 years here, and as he told church members 2 years into his ministry, he felt he was living the truth in the old saying that the pulpit is fitted to the pew and the pew to the pulpit. Growth was so great that a committee was formed in April 1896 to study how best to enlarge that building down on Valley Road. But as Dr. Ayers, who was a member of that committee, later put it, an entirely new and most pleasant phase of the situation arose when a letter was read from the Misses Mary J. and Harriet J. Cooper, offering a parcel of land on Cooper Avenue. Mary and Harriet Cooper, these are those kind of those small albumin print photographs. These were in the archives. They lived next door, as I said, to the church on Valley Road. They had settled in Upper Montclair with their parents in 1859, so they were among the first non-Dutch arrivals. They were both members of the Brookdale Reformed Church, both taught in the Sabbath school there for decades. Harriet was the businesswoman among the two, managing their property and taking an active role in the newly formed charitable organizations in town, including the Children's Home Association and Mountainside Hospital. Friends frequently came to visit them, women such as the wonderfully named Adeline Experience Brown, who was a senior librarian, Matt, at the New York Public Library. She came to visit them and stayed for a while in 1909. Alice Core, a woman from Long Island who lived with them for 36 years, was an early member of Union. Isabella Dorman, whom I quoted earlier about the Harvest Home Festivals, recalled the Cooper sisters in this way. The Cooper sisters were always very helpful, working in the Sunday school, never taking letters from the old church in Brookdale because they knew their help was needed there more than by us. And then she added, and this really surprised me, Miss Mary was our secretary. They inherited their property from their father. This is an 1890 atlas. Sorry, it's not in color. This is their property. It extends from beyond Valley Road, where Starbucks and the post office are today, through CVS, the CVS parking lot, past the Women's Club, all houses along Cooper Avenue. You can see this house, which we walk by at the corner of Park and Cooper, was already built by 1890. And then down past Park Street with this little hitch in the property that exists and how The streets don't meet head-on there, still to this day, down to here. That was their property. And what they offered the church was and what they did then, when Cooper Avenue was put through in 1893 or 1894 on the north side of their property, they created a number of building lots or home lots, all with 100 feet of frontage and about 200 feet deep. And what they offered the church was 200 feet of frontage among the 500 feet they still had. Working up from this house here. They owned 500 feet of frontage working up from there. The church took 200 feet, and they conveyed the tract to the church in February 1894 for the nominal consideration of $1. Oops, what have I done? Did I go past? Somewhere I thought I had, we'll get to it. This 1906 Essex County Atlas shows the degree, if you can see it, there are a lot more houses in 1906 than there were in 1880, certainly. The degree to which housing was built in the last couple decades of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. This sheet is south of Bellevue Avenue. So this is the Cooper property. It's been shifted north, is on the top rather than on the right in this map. This is the Cooper property going this way. This is our church, shaded in blue. Houses have been built next door. Charles Anderson has already given Anderson Park. The paths have been laid out. This is where his house is. These are the houses he built for his children. This is where Franklin and Isabella Dorman are now living, a rather nice bit of property. They held a fundraiser in 1898 at their home for the building of this church. There were 100 participants, adults and children, in that entertainment. They could do something large scale there. Union Bethel, Noble Bethel, if you heard my talk about the windows, he spoke at our church service right after the end of the First World War. His home was there. He succeeded Franklin Dorman as the superintendent of the Sunday school. He was president of the New York Telephone Company. And the Coopers, you can't really see it, the Coopers are still living here. This is still their house. This is still their driveway over to their barn or carriage house. And they still have the property on the other side of Valley Road. And then this second sheet from that atlas, again you can't really see it, but this is Cooper Avenue. Church is here. These are the lots, home lots carved out of the rest of the Cooper land. Cooper Avenue only extended as far as Mary and Harriet Cooper's land. And I found my second connection with the story. I never knew this before. This is the house where my family and I have lived for the last 24 years, and it's it was built on Cooper property. So in 1899, the same year as this church. So our neighbors came through in providing land. The neighbors even came through in providing the concept design for this church. In his remarks in 1932 at the 50th anniversary of the church, Dr. Ayres recalled what happened after the trustees learned of the gift of the property. And this is what he wrote. The Board of Trustees, in the kindness of their hearts, gave me a sort of roving commission with power to obtain suggestions rather than plans. I felt deeply the responsibility of the situation, knowing full well the hazards. So I proceeded cautiously, consulting not an architect, but my good and tried friend, the artist Harry Fenn, who sympathized most heartily in what was before me. The outcome of the consultations was a beautiful sketch of a little church that had caught the eye of the artist, Harry Fenn's eye, of this church in Surrey when Fenn was a young man. And Ayres said, I submitted the sketch to the trustees for their approval. It was subsequently placed before the well-known firm of architects Cady, Berg & C., whose enthusiasm was unbounded, for they quickly saw the possibilities of the drawing And today you have substantially the realization of that sketch in your present church building. We don't have the sketch. I think the architects must have held on to it, and they would have, kind of the way you can do on a photo on the screen now, they would have had to expand it because they needed to create a structure that could hold 550 people. That was their commission. The church in Lurdershall, Surrey, wouldn't hold anywhere close to 550 people. But at a special meeting on March 16th, 1898, the church voted, as you would expect, it took a church meeting of the congregation to vote to proceed with this design. They approved a $40,000 budget to build this church. That was 5 times the size of the annual operating budget in 1898. But this design required a larger tract of land than the one given by the Cooper sisters in 1897. So the Cooper sisters quietly conveyed a second tract with another 100 feet of frontage to the church in January 1899, again for a nominal consideration of $1. And it's not clear at all to me whether the church offered to buy the property, but it was a second gift from the Cooper sisters. And I think this resulting structure, this is a photo of the church before the east wing was built. You can see the street is unpaved, that there's no curb. It's kind of like some of those streets in Glen Ridge. There's this block of stone or granite for helping folks alight from their carriages. The ivy is growing nicely. It was certainly the most impressive building in Upper Montclair at the time. Fully paid for at its dedication, and was still then uncommon, lighted entirely by electricity. The land, as many of you know, was found to be full of springs, so a lot of water underneath the hidden springs. So it was created, as you can see, in such a way that the basement floor would be slightly above street level. The church went all out with a week-long dedication. This is really, again, I'm sorry you can't read it, but they took Monday and Friday off, but every other day for a full week there was a blockbuster program here at the church. It started with, again, surprise, Lyman Abbott giving an address to the children in the morning service with Howard Bliss giving a sermon, but they had the dedication service in the evening of that Sunday, and the sermon was by Lyman Abbott. They ended the week in the morning service with the sermon by, surprise, Amory Bradford. In between, they had all the giants of the day in liberal theology. Judson, you've all heard of Judson Memorial Church in Manhattan. He had been a minister of a Baptist church in East Orange. He came over to give an address. The president of Union Theological Seminary was paired with him. This minister of the Madison Square Presbyterian Church in New York City is the one who took on Tammany Hall and succeeded. Josiah Strong over here was one of the leading advocates of social gospel in that day. They did take time out on Wednesday for an evening of social entertainment, or social enjoyment, with music and informal addresses. I'm closing shortly here. Howard Bliss left in 1902 to become president of the Syrian Protestant College, which is now the American University of Beirut. It had been started by his father. A year later, Franklin and Isabella Dorman's son, what's his name, Harry Dorman, who had become a medical doctor, followed Bliss to Beirut and joined the medical faculty and later headed the hospital at what became the American University in Beirut, and spent his entire 30 or 40-year medical career in Beirut. Dorman's brother Theodore became the prime force behind the Boy Scouts here for about 30 years. A few years after Bliss left, the East Wing was added, the parsonage, Dave, your home was built, and our neighbors, the Cooper sisters, came through to our aid for the third time, and they gave the land on which the parsonage is built, bringing their total gifts to 400 feet of frontage along Cooper Avenue. They tried to remain anonymous. These are the handwritten minutes from the annual meeting on April 4th, 1905, and it's a vote of thanks to, quote, to the donors of the lot of ground on Cooper Avenue. The Montclair Times spilled these 11 days later and said that Harriet Cooper had given this additional land. I think that's wrong. It would have come from both sisters. Today, the church, if you pace it off, which I tried to do the other day, has 500 feet of frontage. Where we are today was a home owned by a family named Van Dyke. It was, I think it was moved across the street to where Katrina lives now when this Vincent building was built. So the church now has 500 feet of frontage. But let me stop there and circle back to where we started and ask what our origin story says to us. In Wendell Berry's terms, what should we speak with when we commune with our past? What principles have been communicated across the generations? And I would suggest, and I'm certainly open to your suggestions from what you've heard, that these are some of the elements that they passed down to us. The first, neighbors working together, open to all denominations, self-governed, focused on education. You only had to listen to all those announcements after church this morning to see the focus on education, but also very much engaged with theological inquiry. Engaged from the very beginning with music and drama. We have lots of programs about concerts and plays and such, going back really into the 19th century in the church archives. And I think really important, and it speaks to the sermon today and to what I suspect next Sunday is about, committed to applying Christian ethics to current social issues and problems. Thank you.